The Partition of India, Hidden Stories and Global Consequences. Freedom at Midnight. August 15, 1947. At the stroke of midnight, India awoke to freedom. Fireworks lit the skies over Delhi. Crowds celebrated in the streets. After nearly 200 years of British colonial rule, the subcontinent had broken free. But for millions, independence was not a celebration. It was the beginning of a nightmare. In a matter of months, a line was drawn across maps, dividing one of the world's oldest civilizations into two newborn nations, India and Pakistan. That line tore apart villages, families, and centuries of shared history. It sparked the largest migration in human history. More than 14 million people were displaced. Trains arrived filled not with passengers, but corpses. Neighbors who once shared food and festivals turned into enemies. This is the story of partition. A story of politics and power, but also of hidden manipulation, betrayal, tragedy, and survival. A story that shaped not only India and Pakistan, but the entire world. Chapter 1: Why Partition Happened. To understand why partition happened, we must return to the decades before 1947. The story of partition did not begin in a single moment. It was the result of centuries of colonial rule, decades of political rivalry, and years of mounting communal tension. By the time independence arrived, partition had become not only likely, but inevitable. The British Empire in decline. The British Empire, once the mightiest in the world, emerged from the Second World War exhausted. The war had drained Britain's treasury and weakened its grip on colonies across Asia and Africa. India, the so-called crown jewel of the empire, had long been restless. Independence movements had grown stronger in the early 20th century, and Britain knew it could no longer govern a nation of nearly 400 million people against its will. But leaving India was not simple. How could an empire just walk away from a land so vast, so diverse, so full of contradictions? Hindus made up the majority, Muslims were the largest minority, and countless other groups, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, Parsis, added to the mosaic. For centuries, these communities had lived together, sharing festivals, markets, and traditions. Yet, under British rule, seeds of division had been sown. Divide and rule. The British governed India with a strategy known as divide and rule. They emphasized religious identity in the census. They introduced separate electorates in 1909, allowing Muslims to vote only for Muslim candidates. To the British, this was a way to weaken Indian unity. But to Indians, it planted suspicion. Communities began to see themselves less as Indians and more as Hindus or Muslims. By the early 20th century, these divisions had hardened. And into this divide stepped two political movements that would shape India's destiny. The rise of the Congress and the Muslim League. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, became the voice of Indian nationalism. By the 1920s and 30s, it was led by Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Congress envisioned a united India. Gandhi dreamed of a secular nation where all religions could live in harmony. Nehru dreamed of a modern, industrial democracy. Opposing them was the All India Muslim League, founded in 1906. Led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the League spoke for many Muslims who feared marginalization in a Hindu-majority India. Jinnah had once been a Congress leader himself. He admired secular democracy. But over time, he lost faith in Hindu-Muslim cooperation. He came to believe that Muslims would never truly be safe in a united India. His solution, a separate homeland, Pakistan, the land of the pure. The idea of Pakistan. In 1940, at the Muslim League's annual session in Lahore, Jinnah declared that Hindus and Muslims were two nations, with different religions, cultures, and ways of life. The Lahore Resolution called for Muslim-majority regions in the northwest and northeast to form independent states. The demand shocked many. For centuries, Muslims and Hindus had shared the same soil. But now, a future was being imagined where they would no longer share the same country. The idea of Pakistan gave hope to millions of Muslims who feared being overwhelmed in a Hindu-majority India. But it also filled millions of Hindus and Sikhs with dread, the thought of losing their homes, their lands, their heritage. The 1940s, a decade of fire. The 1940s were a turning point. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, demanding the British leave at once. Millions joined the protests. The British responded with brutal repression, jailing Gandhi, Nehru, and thousands of others. Meanwhile, World War II raged. Over 2 million Indian soldiers fought for the British, the largest volunteer army in history. Yet, while Indians died abroad, famine struck at home. In Bengal, in 1943, famine killed nearly 3 million people. Many blamed British policies for the disaster. The war also revealed Britain's weakness. It could no longer hold India by force. Independence was only a matter of time. But independence for whom, and under what terms? That question would rip the nation apart. The collapse of compromise. In 1946, the British sent a cabinet mission to India to negotiate independence. Their plan proposed a united India with strong provinces and weak central government, a compromise meant to satisfy both Congress and the Muslim League. But mistrust ran too deep. Congress rejected the idea of weak central authority. Jinnah feared Muslims would be outvoted in a strong central India. The talks collapsed. That summer, the Muslim League launched Direct Action Day in Calcutta to press its demand for Pakistan. What followed was horror. Riots broke out, leaving over 4,000 people dead in just a few days. The violence spread to Bihar, to Noakhali in Bengal, to Punjab. Neighbors who had lived together for generations turned against each other. Blood filled the streets. It became clear, coexistence was breaking down. The choice was no longer between partition and unity. It was between partition and civil war. The last days of Gandhi. In these dark times, Gandhi fought desperately for peace. He walked barefoot through villages torn by violence. In Bengal, he fasted until Hindus and Muslims swore to stop killing each other. His presence calmed riots, for a time. But Gandhi's dream of a united India was slipping away. Even within Congress, leaders like Nehru and Patel began to see partition as inevitable. They argued it was the only way to secure independence without endless bloodshed. For Gandhi, it was heartbreak. For Jinnah, it was victory. For the British, it was a convenient exit strategy. The road to partition. By early 1947, the British knew they had to leave. Mountbatten, the last viceroy, arrived with orders to transfer power quickly. The decision was made. India would be divided into two nations, India and Pakistan. But no one could imagine the scale of the tragedy that lay ahead. Partition was not just a political compromise. It was a rupture in the lives of millions. It was the tearing apart of families, of homes, of entire histories. It was a wound that still bleeds. Closing of Chapter 1. The partition of India did not emerge from nowhere. It was born of empire, of mistrust, of leaders and their visions. It was born of Gandhi's dream, Jinnah's demand, and the British policy of divide and rule. It was born of riots and negotiations, of famine and war, of hope and fear. And in August 1947, it became reality. But this was only the beginning. The line had been drawn. Now came the human cost. Chapter 2: The British Hand, Borders, Betrayals, and Hidden Agendas. Partition was not just an Indian story. It was also a British story, of an empire in retreat, desperate to exit with dignity, and perhaps, with influence intact. When Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in India as the last viceroy in March 1947, his task was monumental, to oversee Britain's withdrawal and hand over power to Indian leaders. But he had little time. Mountbatten had been instructed to leave India by June 1948. Instead, he accelerated the timeline by nearly a year. Independence and partition would happen in August 1947. Why the rush? And who benefited from it? These remain some of the most debated questions in history. The Mountbatten Plan. Mountbatten was charismatic, but also reckless. He believed speed was essential to avoid chaos, but in reality, his haste created the very chaos he feared. At the heart of the partition plan was the division of two vast provinces, Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east. Both had deep intermingling of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. How do you draw a line between communities that had lived side by side for centuries? The answer lay with one man, Cyril Radcliffe. The man who drew the borders. Cyril Radcliffe was a British lawyer. He had never set foot in India before 1947. He knew little about its geography, culture, or people. Yet he was given the impossible task of drawing new borders, the Radcliffe Line, in just 5 weeks. Radcliffe worked in secrecy, locked away with maps, census data, and a small team. He never visited the villages his pen would divide. He had no time to understand the rivers, the crops, the trade routes, or the human ties that connected communities. When he finished, his line cut through villages, fields, and even homes. Families found themselves citizens of different countries overnight. Farmers woke up to find their wells on the other side of the border. Entire railway lines and irrigation systems were split in two. It was, quite literally, a line of blood, the hidden British motives. But why was the process so rushed? Many historians believe the British had their own reasons. First, Britain was financially exhausted after World War II. They could no longer afford to maintain India, but they also feared a prolonged exit could drain resources further. Second, the world had entered the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence. By dividing India, Britain ensured the region would remain unstable, and therefore, dependent on Western support. Third, Britain sought to maintain a strategic presence in South Asia. Pakistan, carved out of India's northwest frontier, provided Britain, and later the United States, with a potential ally bordering Soviet Central Asia. Some even argue that partition was not merely a retreat, but a carefully planned strategy to keep the subcontinent weak and divided. Voices of betrayal. Indian leaders felt betrayed. Gandhi called partition a tragedy, a betrayal of India's unity. He refused to celebrate independence and instead spent the night of August 15 fasting in Calcutta, praying for peace. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, was more pragmatic. He accepted partition as the price of freedom. But even he admitted the speed and secrecy of the British plan left India unprepared for what followed. On the other side, Muhammad Ali Jinnah hailed partition as the fulfillment of the Muslim League's demand. Yet even Jinnah was shocked at the borders. He expected Lahore to be in Pakistan, it was. But Calcutta, the heart of Bengal, went to India. His new country began life with fewer resources than promised. The Midnight Decision. Perhaps the greatest symbol of the British hand in partition was the very moment of independence. The British set the date, midnight, August 15, 1947. At that stroke, India and Pakistan were born. But the Radcliffe Award, the actual map of the new borders, was not published until August 17, 2 days after independence. That meant millions celebrated without knowing whether they belonged to India or Pakistan. In villages across Punjab and Bengal, people woke up to discover they were suddenly on the wrong side. It was chaos, and it was deadly. The cost of British haste. The rushed exit left no time for orderly transfer. Armies were divided in haste. Trains were rerouted without planning. Refugee camps were overwhelmed. And into this vacuum of uncertainty, violence exploded. Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, once neighbors, turned on each other. Historians estimate that 1 to 2 million people were killed, and 14 million displaced. Women were abducted, families were torn apart, and entire villages were wiped out. Partition was not only the birth of two nations. It was also the death of an old India, one where diversity had once been strength. Closing of Chapter 2. The British hand in partition was decisive. With the stroke of a pen, Cyril Radcliffe reshaped the destiny of millions. With their haste and hidden agendas, Britain left behind not just two nations, but a wound that has yet to fully heal. The question remains, was partition inevitable, or was it engineered? Was it a tragic necessity, or a deliberate strategy? What is clear is this: the British departure was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of migration, of suffering, and of a rivalry that would dominate South Asia for decades to come. Chapter 3: The Human Cost of Partition, Migration, Massacre, and Survival. History often remembers partition in numbers: 14 million displaced, up to 2 million killed, thousands of women abducted. But behind each number was a human being, with a family, a home, a life suddenly shattered. This was not just a political event. It was one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. The largest migration in human history. Never before, and never since, has the world seen a migration of this scale. On one side, Muslims fled from India into Pakistan. On the other, Hindus and Sikhs streamed out of Pakistan into India. Villages emptied. Cities became refugee towns. Caravans of people stretched for miles. Entire families walked for weeks under burning sun, carrying only what they could on their backs. Ox carts creaked under the weight of children and possessions. Along the roads lay bodies, those who could not survive the journey. It was a migration not of hope, but of fear. Trains of death. The railways, once a proud symbol of British India's modernity, became instruments of horror. Refugee trains were meant to carry people safely across the new borders. But soon, they earned another name: the trains of death. Carriages packed with families would arrive at stations silent, everyone inside slaughtered. Survivors recalled trains pulling into Lahore or Amritsar filled with nothing but corpses. Blood dripping from the wooden boards. Silence where once there had been chatter of children. For many, the sound of a train whistle in 1947 did not mean travel. It meant terror. Neighbors against neighbors. Partition violence was not a distant war. It happened in homes, in streets, in fields. Neighbors who had lived side by side for generations turned against each other. In Punjab, entire villages of Sikhs were wiped out by Muslim mobs, and Muslim villages were slaughtered in retaliation. In Bengal, communal riots erupted, fueled by decades of mistrust. Men armed with swords, axes, and guns attacked those they once shared festivals with. Temples and mosques were set ablaze. Even wells, sources of life, were poisoned. The targeting of women. And in the midst of this horror, women bore the heaviest burden. Tens of thousands were abducted, raped, or forced into marriages across the border. Some families, desperate to protect honor, took unthinkable steps. There are recorded stories of women leaping into wells together, committing suicide to escape capture. Entire groups of Sikh women drowned themselves in rivers, choosing death over dishonor. This gendered violence left scars that lasted generations. Many women who survived never spoke of it, carrying their pain in silence. Children of Partition. Partition's youngest victims were the children. Lost in the chaos, thousands were separated from their families. Some wandered into refugee camps alone. Others were adopted across borders, never to know their true parents. A child who went missing in 1947 might grow up decades later not even knowing whether they were born Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh. Identity itself became a casualty of partition. The refugee camps. In Delhi, Lahore, Karachi, and Calcutta, refugee camps sprang up overnight. They were overwhelmed from the beginning. Tens of thousands crammed into tents with little food, water, or medicine. Disease spread quickly. In Delhi, old forts were turned into camps. Families huddled in ruined Mughal halls, once built for emperors, now sheltering the displaced. In Lahore, government buildings overflowed with refugees desperate for shelter. Aid trickled in, but it was never enough. The governments of India and Pakistan, themselves newborn and fragile, struggled to cope with the scale of human suffering. Personal stories. To truly understand partition, we must listen to those who lived it. One survivor remembered, "We left our home in Punjab with nothing but the clothes on our backs. My mother carried my baby sister. Halfway through the journey, she died in her arms. We buried her by the roadside and kept walking." Another recalled boarding a train from Amritsar. "We thought we were safe. Then men boarded with knives. I jumped from the moving train. I never saw my parents again." These are not isolated stories. They echo across families on both sides of the border, Muslims fleeing India, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing Pakistan. Each carried loss that words can barely describe. The silence of Gandhi. While leaders celebrated freedom, one man refused to rejoice. Mahatma Gandhi, father of India's independence movement, did not attend the flag raising in Delhi. Instead, he walked the streets of Calcutta, trying to stop riots with his very presence. He fasted, prayed, and pleaded for peace. To many, Gandhi's silence and sadness captured the truth: independence had come at too high a cost. The burden of memory. The tragedy of partition did not end in 1947. Its memories lived on. Survivors carried trauma their whole lives. Some never spoke of it. Others told their stories only in whispers. Entire generations grew up hearing fragments: a lost uncle, a vanished village, a house left behind across the border. For those who lived through it, partition was not history. It was a wound that never fully healed. Global echoes. The human cost of partition reached beyond South Asia. In Britain, where many refugees later migrated, communities carried stories of loss and resilience. In Canada, the US, and the Middle East, the South Asian diaspora grew, shaped by memories of displacement. Partition was not just India and Pakistan's tragedy. It was the world's. It showed how quickly communities can unravel, how easily politics can tear apart centuries of coexistence. Closing of Chapter 3. The partition of 1947 was not merely about new borders. It was about the millions forced to leave behind their homes, their neighbors, their loved ones. It was about trains filled with corpses, wells filled with bodies, and silence filled with grief. It was about mothers who lost children, children who lost parents, and communities that lost trust forever. But it was also about survival. About resilience. About ordinary people who, despite unimaginable suffering, rebuilt lives in new lands. Partition was a wound, deep, painful, unforgettable. But it was also a testament to the human spirit, the ability to endure, to carry memory, and to keep moving forward. Chapter 4: Partition and Pakistan, the birth of a fragile new nation. On August 14, 1947, the world witnessed the birth of a new nation, Pakistan. At midnight, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, hailed as the Quaid-e-Azam, or Great Leader, addressed his people in Karachi. His voice, calm yet resolute, declared, "You are free. You are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosques, or to any other places of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion, caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state." For millions of Muslims, Pakistan was not just a new country. It was a dream, a homeland where they could live without fear of domination. A land of hope, identity, and dignity. But the dream quickly collided with reality. A nation born in crisis. Pakistan was carved out of India's northwest and northeast, West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh. From the beginning, the new state faced enormous challenges. Unlike India, Pakistan had no established capital, no central government offices, no army headquarters. Everything had to be built from scratch. Refugees poured into cities like Karachi and Lahore, overwhelming the fragile administration. The new government had little money. Out of the £3 billion reserves of undivided India, Pakistan was allotted just £750 million, and even that was delayed. India inherited the seat of government, the railways, the industries, and the bureaucracy. Pakistan, by contrast, began life with very little. As one historian put it, India got the bride, Pakistan got the wedding dress. Jinnah's Pakistan. At the center of Pakistan's birth was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Once a successful lawyer in Bombay, Jinnah had risen to lead the Muslim League and champion the demand for a separate homeland. For many, he was the embodiment of Pakistan itself. His charisma united Muslims who otherwise spoke different languages, lived in different regions, and followed different traditions. But Jinnah was gravely ill. He had tuberculosis, a fact hidden from the public. Within a year of independence, in September 1948, he would be dead. His loss left Pakistan without its guiding figure, without the man who might have steered the country toward stability. The nation was now adrift, struggling to define what Pakistan truly meant. The question of identity. What was Pakistan meant to be? This question haunted the young state from its earliest days. For Jinnah, Pakistan was not necessarily an Islamic theocracy. In his speeches, he envisioned a secular state where religion was a private matter. But for many of his supporters, Pakistan was created precisely to be a Muslim homeland. Should it follow Islamic law? Or should it be a modern democracy with Muslim identity at its core? This unresolved debate about identity, Islamic or secular, religious or democratic, would shape Pakistan's politics for decades to come. Refugees and resentment. Partition brought millions of refugees into Pakistan. In Punjab, Muslim families fled from India in endless streams. In Sindh, Karachi's streets overflowed with newcomers. The refugees, known as Muhajirs, were grateful for sanctuary but also carried resentment. They had left behind homes, businesses, and property. Many expected the state to compensate them. Local communities sometimes clashed with these newcomers, straining social fabric. Even in its first year, Pakistan was not only fighting external challenges, but also internal divisions. The division of the army. Another challenge lay in defense. The Indian Army had been one of the largest colonial forces in the world. At partition, it was divided. 2/3 of the resources went to India, 1/3 to Pakistan. But Pakistan received fewer officers, less equipment, and had to build its military command almost overnight. This imbalance became painfully clear within months. In October 1947, tribal militias from Pakistan's northwest invaded Kashmir. India and Pakistan fought their first war. By the time a UN ceasefire was declared in 1949, Pakistan controlled 1/3 of Kashmir, India the rest. The issue would define the relationship between the two countries for generations. The struggle of East Pakistan. Pakistan was unique. It existed in two wings separated by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory. West Pakistan, with its Punjabi, Sindhi, Pashtun, and Baloch populations, held most of the political power. East Pakistan, home to Bengali Muslims, had the larger population but was treated as a junior partner. When Urdu was declared the national language, Bengalis protested, demanding recognition of their own tongue. This language controversy planted seeds of resentment that would one day lead to civil war and the birth of Bangladesh in 1971. The role of religion and military. In the absence of Jinnah, power struggles intensified. Civilian leaders squabbled. The bureaucracy gained influence. And increasingly, the army stepped in as the guardian of the state. Religion too became a rallying cry. In 1949, the Objectives Resolution declared that Pakistan would be guided by the principles of Islam. Yet the exact meaning remained vague, leaving room for future debates and future conflicts. The Cold War factor. Pakistan's fragile beginning also drew the attention of global powers. The Cold War was in full swing. To the United States, Pakistan's strategic position, bordering the Soviet Union and China, made it a potential ally. By the 1950s, Pakistan aligned itself with Washington, receiving military and economic aid. But this alliance came at a cost. Pakistan's dependence on foreign powers reinforced the military's role in politics and tied its fate to global rivalries. Everyday life amid chaos. For ordinary Pakistanis, the first years of independence were filled with hardship, but also resilience. Refugee families built new lives in Karachi, Lahore, and Rawalpindi. Markets reopened, schools welcomed displaced children, and trains once again carried passengers instead of corpses. Despite shortages and uncertainty, there was also pride. Pakistan was their homeland, won through sacrifice. A place to call their own after centuries of domination. Closing of Chapter 4. Pakistan was born out of trauma, a fragile state carved from partition's wounds. It struggled with identity, with refugees, with language, with war. It lost its founding father within a year, and its future hung in the balance. But the idea of Pakistan, a homeland for South Asia's Muslims, endured. For its citizens, it was worth every sacrifice. For its leaders, it was a challenge without end. Partition had given Pakistan life. But it had also given it challenges that would shape its destiny for generations to come. Chapter 5 India after partition, the struggles and strength of a new nation. On the midnight of August 15, 1947, India awoke to freedom. Jawaharlal Nehru, in his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, declared, "At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." But as the words echoed through the new parliament in Delhi, the reality outside was far less poetic. Independence had come hand in hand with partition. India had lost millions of its citizens to Pakistan. It had absorbed millions more as refugees. Its economy was drained, its borders unstable, its society wounded. This was not just the birth of a nation. It was the rebirth of a civilization, under extraordinary strain. The refugee challenge. In the weeks after partition, trains carrying refugees streamed into India from Lahore, Multan, and Karachi. By the end of 1947, nearly 7 million Hindus and Sikhs had crossed into India. Cities like Delhi and Amritsar were overwhelmed. Entire neighborhoods had to be built overnight. Camps sprang up in abandoned military barracks, in schools, in open fields. Refugees often arrived with nothing. No money, no possessions, only trauma. Delhi, once a quiet Mughal capital, nearly doubled in population within months. Tents stretched across the city, filled with families waiting for resettlement. For the Indian state, only weeks old, this was a massive logistical nightmare. Land had to be redistributed. Jobs had to be found. Homes had to be built. And yet, slowly, painfully, the refugees rebuilt their lives. Many went on to become successful entrepreneurs, politicians, and artists, leaving a permanent mark on Indian society. Economic aftershocks. Partition split not just land, but also industries. Pakistan inherited much of the fertile agricultural land in Punjab and Sindh. India retained most of the industry, but lost access to crucial resources, including jute-growing areas in East Bengal. Millions of skilled workers were displaced. Railways were disrupted. Trade networks collapsed. The economy of independent India began under severe stress. Food shortages loomed. Inflation rose. Yet, under Nehru's leadership, India began charting a new path, one of planned economic development. The government launched 5-year plans, investing in dams, factories, and universities. The vision was clear: India would not merely survive partition. It would rise from it, building an economy rooted in self-reliance and modern industry. The question of identity, secularism versus religion. One of the greatest impacts of partition on India was not economic, but ideological. Pakistan had been created as a homeland for Muslims. What then was India? For Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, the answer was clear: India must remain secular. It must be a home for all: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, and more. But this ideal was tested from the very beginning. Communal riots continued after partition. Muslims who stayed in India often faced suspicion and hostility. In 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who opposed his vision of unity. The bullets that killed Gandhi symbolized the deep struggle India faced. Would it remain a plural, secular state, or would it descend into religious nationalism? Against all odds, India chose secularism. The constitution, adopted in 1950, guaranteed equal rights to all citizens regardless of religion. Partition had nearly broken the nation. But in response, India built its identity around inclusivity. The rise of democracy. Partition also tested India's political system. The country began with enormous diversity, hundreds of languages, dozens of ethnic groups, deep religious divides. Some doubted that democracy could work in such conditions. Could millions of illiterate peasants truly participate in free elections? Could a nation wounded by partition truly hold together without dictatorship? The answer came in 1951, when India held its first general election, the largest democratic exercise in history at that time. Over 173 million people were eligible to vote. Millions of women, for the first time, cast their ballots as equal citizens. Despite logistical nightmares, the election succeeded. Partition had fractured India. But democracy gave it unity. The wound of Kashmir. Partition left one question unresolved: the fate of princely states. Most joined India or Pakistan peacefully. But Kashmir, a Muslim-majority state ruled by a Hindu king, became the flashpoint. When tribal militias invaded from Pakistan in October 1947, Kashmir's ruler turned to India for help. In exchange for military assistance, he signed the Instrument of Accession, bringing Kashmir into India. This decision sparked the First India-Pakistan War. For India, Kashmir became more than territory. It was a symbol of its secular identity, proof that a Muslim-majority region could belong in a Hindu-majority but secular nation. But for Pakistan, Kashmir was the unfinished business of partition. This unresolved conflict would haunt both nations for decades, and remains a source of tension even today. The social fabric, trauma and resilience. Partition did more than redraw borders. It redrew relationships. Communities once intertwined were torn apart. In cities like Lahore and Delhi, neighborhoods changed overnight. In Delhi, entire Muslim quarters emptied as families fled to Pakistan. In Lahore, Hindu and Sikh districts were abandoned. And yet, amid the pain, resilience emerged. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who had survived violence rebuilt their communities. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to process the trauma through literature and cinema. Films like Garam Hawa and novels like Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan gave voice to partition's human cost. The memory of partition became part of India's cultural DNA, a reminder of both suffering and survival. The shadow of nationalism. Partition also gave rise to a new wave of nationalism. For many Indians, independence was a moment of pride, but partition was a wound. This duality shaped Indian politics. On one hand, leaders like Nehru emphasized unity, secularism, and progress. On the other, Hindu nationalist movements began to grow, fueled by resentment that India had been divided to create Pakistan. This tension between inclusive nationalism and religious nationalism would remain central to India's identity. Even decades later, the ghost of partition continues to shape debates over who truly belongs in the Indian nation. Global positioning, India on the world stage. Partition also shaped India's role in global politics. Unlike Pakistan, which aligned with the United States, India under Nehru chose a path of non-alignment. India refused to join either Cold War bloc. Instead, it became a leader of the non-aligned movement, alongside countries like Egypt and Yugoslavia. Partition had shown India the dangers of division. On the world stage, it sought independence, not just from colonialism, but from superpower rivalry. Women and partition's legacy. For Indian women, partition brought both tragedy and transformation. Many were victims of violence and displacement. But many also stepped into new roles as families resettled. Women worked in refugee camps, started businesses, and entered politics. Partition forced India to rethink gender roles, even as it deepened patriarchal wounds. Over time, women like Indira Gandhi would rise to positions of immense power, reshaping Indian politics itself. Closing of Chapter 5. Partition was India's darkest hour, but also its defining test. The refugee crisis, the economic shock, the communal violence, all could have torn the nation apart. But instead, India rebuilt. It chose secularism over sectarianism, democracy over dictatorship, and unity over disintegration. The scars of partition remain, in memories, in politics, in unresolved conflicts like Kashmir. But out of the trauma, India forged resilience. Partition was not just the end of colonial rule. It was the beginning of India's journey, a journey of survival, rebuilding, and the constant struggle to live up to the ideals of freedom and unity. Chapter 6: Global Consequences of Partition, from South Asia to the world. The partition of India in 1947 was not just a regional tragedy. It was a global event, one whose consequences extended far beyond the borders of South Asia. It shaped the destiny of two nations, but it also influenced geopolitics, international migration, and the balance of power in the world. Partition was not merely about India and Pakistan. It was about the Cold War, about diaspora communities, about nuclear weapons, and about the world's continuing struggle with identity and division. This is the story of partition's global legacy. The first refugees of globalization. One of partition's immediate global impacts was the creation of a vast refugee population. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan. Muslims fled India. Families scattered across continents in search of safety and opportunity. In Britain, thousands of South Asians arrived in the 1950s and 60s, invited to fill post-war labor shortages. Many were refugees or descendants of those displaced by partition. They built new lives in cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester, creating vibrant communities but also facing racism and cultural challenges. In Canada, the United States, and the Middle East, South Asians carried partition's memory with them. Today, the South Asian diaspora numbers over 30 million people worldwide. In every corner of the globe, from Toronto to Dubai, from Nairobi to New York, communities shaped by partition tell stories of loss, resilience, and identity. Partition was not just the largest migration of the 20th century. It was also the first wave of globalization's refugees. The Kashmir conflict, a global flashpoint. Perhaps the most direct global consequence of partition was the conflict over Kashmir. In 1947, when India and Pakistan clashed over the princely state, it was more than a border dispute. It became the seed of a rivalry that would shake world politics. The Kashmir conflict soon drew in global powers. The United Nations intervened in 1948, calling for a ceasefire and promising a plebiscite that never came. As decades passed, Kashmir remained the unfinished business of partition. For India, Kashmir was proof of its secular ideals. For Pakistan, it was a symbol of Muslim identity. For the world, it was a dangerous fault line. In 1974, India tested its first nuclear device. In 1998, Pakistan responded with nuclear tests of its own. Two nuclear powers, born of partition, now faced each other across the world's most militarized border. The shadow of nuclear war became a permanent global concern. Every conflict in Kashmir carried not just regional danger, but the risk of global catastrophe. Partition and the Cold War. Partition happened at the dawn of the Cold War, and it quickly became entangled in superpower rivalry. India, under Nehru, chose non-alignment. It refused to join either the American or Soviet camp, instead leading the non-aligned movement. Pakistan, by contrast, aligned with the West. In the 1950s, it joined military alliances like SEATO and CENTO, receiving weapons and aid from the United States. This alignment gave Pakistan short-term security, but also tied it to Cold War politics. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, Pakistan became a frontline state, arming and training Mujahideen fighters with American and Saudi support. The roots of modern global terrorism, and the instability that followed, can be traced in part back to these Cold War choices shaped by partition's creation of Pakistan as a vulnerable, strategically located state. The birth of Bangladesh, a global humanitarian crisis. Partition's legacy did not end in 1947. In 1971, it erupted again. Tensions between West Pakistan and East Pakistan, fueled by language, culture, and inequality, boiled over into civil war. India intervened, supporting Bengali independence fighters. Within weeks, Pakistan's army surrendered, and East Pakistan became the new nation of Bangladesh. The war created one of the largest refugee crises since 1947. 10 million people fled into India, overwhelming its resources. The world watched as partition's fault lines once again redrew maps. Bangladesh's independence was a global story, of humanitarian crisis, of Cold War maneuvering, and of the unfinished legacy of 1947. Partition and the global South Asian identity. For millions of South Asians abroad, partition shaped identity in ways subtle and profound. In the UK, Indians, Pakistanis, and later Bangladeshis often lived side by side in immigrant neighborhoods, but carried memories of division. Cricket matches between India and Pakistan became emotional events, played not only in stadiums but in diaspora hearts. In North America, South Asians began to rediscover shared roots. Writers, filmmakers, and artists explored partition's trauma, often bridging identities that politics had divided. Globally, partition created not just separation, but dialogue, a continuing struggle to reconcile difference with common heritage. Lessons for the world, borders and division. The partition of India also became a cautionary tale for the world. It showed the dangers of hastily drawn borders. From Palestine in 1948 to Sudan in 2011, the shadow of partition loomed. Communities split by lines on maps often faced the same fate: violence, displacement, and mistrust. Partition became a symbol of what happens when politics ignores people, when identity is weaponized, when leaders choose division over dialogue. Culture, memory, and healing. Even decades later, partition remains alive in global culture. Novels like Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children and films like Earth 1947 bring the tragedy to international audiences. Academic debates, museum exhibitions, and oral history projects seek to preserve survivors' memories. For the world, partition is not only South Asia's story. It is a universal story of migration, trauma, and resilience. It reminds us of the fragility of peace, and the enduring need for reconciliation. Partition in the 21st century. Today, more than 75 years after partition, its consequences still shape global headlines. India and Pakistan remain locked in rivalry, their militaries facing each other across contested borders. Kashmir remains a flashpoint, drawing concern from Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and beyond. Diaspora communities continue to negotiate identities shaped by 1947. And the world continues to grapple with questions of migration, borders, and belonging, questions partition brought into sharp focus. Closing reflections. Partition was the end of empire. But it was also the beginning of a global story, one that touched millions and continues to touch millions more. It created nations. It created refugees. It created conflicts and alliances that reshaped the world. It was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but also a lesson, a warning, a reminder. That when lines are drawn in haste, when communities are divided, the consequences are not contained. They ripple across borders, across generations, across the globe. The partition of India was not just a South Asian story, it was, and remains, a world story. A story of loss. A story of survival. A story whose consequences we are still living today. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths of history on Uncovering Facts.